just
Oh, okay,
some
cool.
easy.
So I probably have like the least sexy part of every conversation, which is compliance. Although honestly, a lot more people are interested about it in the crypto world now than were 4 years ago. So I guess at least we've got that going for us. So with the security token space and what's happening with investments into crypto, unfortunately, from the compliance perspective, it brings together the combination of with securities incredibly highly regulated and with public blockchains incredibly high risk. And so from that perspective, and the reason for that is because basically once you put an asset on an open blockchain, it can be more or less freely traded. Some of the new security token standards will have some limits around that. But because of that, it's sort of treated like it's someone showing up with a bucket full of cash at your front door. And so you need to sort of treat it that way and take more precautions when you're dealing with a security that's sitting on top of a blockchain than a security that's written on a piece of paper, strangely enough. So what that means for everybody is that really your compliance planning starts day one. And your compliance planning actually even ties into what kind of security you're offering. And I say this because your first step in your compliance journey is never going to be with me. It's always going to be with your compliance counsel, who you're going to be sitting down and working with to come up with what the appropriate policies and plans are for specifically what you're doing. And in that case, you're going to be looking for two overlapping pieces of expertise. When ICOs first started, what you saw was there were a whole bunch of people who had experience in crypto law, but had absolutely no experience in securities law that were advising companies in the space about how to deal with these tokens. And as a result of that, what we found is a lot of those token offerings ended up running afoul of securities laws. Because the people that were advising them weren't experts in that area. And so you want to make sure very upfront, day one, you've got somebody that's a securities law expert. What's happening a little bit in this second wave is people know they need a securities lawyer, so they go to a securities lawyer, but they go to one that doesn't know anything about blockchains or crypto. And while that doesn't prevent their offering from going out, what it does frequently mean is they get 6 or 9 months down the road and figured out there was a whole swath of things that they were missing that they needed to be paying attention to, and they effectively have to go back to the starting board. And so as you're building your early team of people that you're going to work with, you either need to find a lawyer who has experience both in the securities world and the crypto world, and there's only a pretty small handful of those globally. And so they tend to be difficult to find and expensive. Or you find lawyers that combined have that experience, either inside of the same firm or working with different firms. Another thing that's typically going to be different in this kind of offering than a traditional financial offering is the global nature of what's happening with blockchain and crypto. So some of the securities offerings that we see happening are happening just inside of one jurisdiction like the US, but many of the offerings that we're seeing have people that are soliciting investors from inside the United States, as well as from a number of other jurisdictions globally. And so what that means is that you're going to need to comply with securities law, as well as anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing laws in each of the jurisdictions from which you're getting investors. Look, if you're getting one investor from a tiny country in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the chance that they're going to take an action and come after you is pretty low. The US tends to be the most aggressive in terms of enforcement. However, from a realistic perspective, you do need to pay attention to the laws in the different places you're coming from. And you need to be serious about the way that you go about that. A lot of what you're going to see is really different from the way that people thought about the early ICOs and early token sale planning. What you saw in the early days of ICOs was that a lot of the compliance was an afterthought. You basically figured out all your marketing plans and everything else that you wanted to do, and then 2 weeks before you started actually collecting money, you said, oh shoot, I need to do KYC. And you tried to find somebody that did something sort of like KYC that you could call to pretend that you were doing something. And that won't work in this era. when you're dealing in the securities world, the compliance is the product that you're selling to the regulator. And so they're actually going to be evaluating your compliance plans, how you're dealing with both the securities laws as well as the Treasury Department's laws, before they approve your offering. And so this is something that you're going to want to have in place from day one. And then, the other thing, and this is something that you touched on, I think, really well, is that the technology needs to actually support what you're doing from a securities perspective. So one of the things that's true in the securities world is, so like if I'm selling you Bitcoin, right? What I'm responsible for when I sell you Bitcoin is like the anti-money laundering and the compliance for that individual transaction. I need to know that you're not a criminal, right? Well, if I'm issuing a security, I have responsibility not just for that initial transaction, but I have responsibility for how the market for that security performs afterwards, and are there appropriate controls in place? So, it doesn't mean that if there's one bad actor that gets your security, you're going to be in trouble. But what it does mean is if you don't have a system in place around the management of your security after it's issued that ensures that all of the controls that you say are going to be in place are in place, you can be held liable for that. And that comes in two forms that come up and that drive directly into the technical standards that are being built around security tokens. The first is what we work on, anti-money laundering, know your customer, counterterrorism financing. So you need to make sure that when that security is transferred, it's going to somebody else who is also not a member of ISIS or John Gotti. But then the second piece is, there's something around securities called legending, where the legending is basically the rules under which that asset can be transferred. And so, for example, if I do something, I'm going to get some of these security laws wrong, and so I don't want to name one of the ones. So if I do something under one reg, I actually can't take overseas investors for that specific offering. I can actually only take US investors in that bucket. And I might have another bucket that I can't take US investors in because it's not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Well, those both could be underlying pieces of the same company, but those tokens couldn't be traded back and forth fungibly. They become sort of non-fungible inside of the groups. And so you need to have transfer restrictions built into the token itself, which is one of the big differences between what's out there with ERC20 and what's coming with some of the things like EIP 1400 and some of the others, is putting in both legending, so that when I buy a token, I can see before I buy it what all the transfer restrictions are, and then also those transfer restrictions themselves that provide those protections. I know I'm going kind of all over the place here, but there's a lot of different stuff to go on. And then I'm going to kind of skip over these, but just things to keep in mind, because again, they're different than if you were dealing with previous token offerings. When you're dealing with a security and a broker-dealer is selling that security to someone, they actually have to care about whether or not that is a suitable investment for the person, whether it's the right thing for them to buy. If I go on a Bitcoin exchange or an Ethereum exchange, that exchange has no responsibility to know whether or not my investment is responsible. If I'm selling somebody a security as a broker-dealer, I do have that responsibility. So that's another layer of investigation that may need to happen above and beyond the base KYC for anti-money laundering purposes. And then finally, again, different than ICOs and was touched on earlier, is you're going to have a number of reporting requirements around what your financial status is and other things after the fact to keep the market informed of what's going on. I touched on a lot of topics there. Why don't we dig into them more on the panel?